Hi, welcome to this introduction to electrochemical biosensors and specifically the impact of the Michaelis Menten kinetics and enzyme inhibition with respect to electrochemical biosensors. So when I say electrochemical biosensors, I've got a couple of examples in front of me. We've got a sort of point of care diagnostic or point of kind of need diagnostic where you would take one of these kind of electrochemical biosensors and you would put them into a device that looks kind of very, let's say, handheld. And that would be a good example of a sort of point of care diagnostics format. And then another example of where you can use enzyme sensors. This is a microneedle type watch that can be worn around the wrist. And what happens there is you've got microneedles that are microneedles that are functionalized with enzymes, for example. And then you can detect something like glucose through the skin using microneedles. So that's giving you a bit of a context that's what at ZEP we're interested in, and the kind of people who would find this video interesting will also be interested in those kind of technologies. With that said, let me speak now about the Michaelis Menten and its kind of impact and its utility in the world of electrochemical biosensors. So let's just jump in a little bit. So topics today are examples of biosensors. I'll mention glucose and alcohol, ketones, etc. I'll talk about the Michaelis Menten equation. And the Michaelis Menten equation, by the way, it really does define a curve, and that curve truly reflects what we actually end up seeing in the lab. So it's not just a theory. The theory is actually very well correlated with practice. So we'll talk about the Michaelis Menten kinetics. We'll also, and I'll just highlight a bit of that. We'll also talk about enzyme inhibition. Now, enzyme inhibition is it's a personal interest, the way that an enzyme that's otherwise working perfectly well can be inhibited by other molecules. Now, this may be super interesting to people in drug discovery. And this particular, let's say, video is really about, very, very much focused on people who are interested in electrochemical biosensors. But the inhibition of enzymes is also a way of making a biosensor. So, for example, if the small molecule that you're interested in doesn't have a natural enzyme for it, it may end up inhibiting another enzyme, and that could be the way that you've actually developed your electrochemical biosensor. So I will talk about competitive inhibition, I'll talk about uncompetitive inhibition, and I'll also talk about non-competitive inhibition. And when you've got a mixture of uncompetitive and non-competitive, then you can call that mixed competitive inhibition. So that's more like a sort of side note, let's say, in the overall discussion this afternoon. I will talk about technologies for biosensor developers. So I'll primarily just sort of put my hand on and talk about the Sensi-All platform from Zimmer and Peacock, which is really a potentiostat. And for people who are doing let's say enzyme sensors, then the amperometry mode is one of the most useful modes. That potentiostat is actually controlled by my phone, which is in Bluetooth connection with it. At the moment, I've got it in glucose mode, so you can appreciate we're using a glucose enzyme in that. Anyway, that's something that I'll just sort of touch on, let's say, near the end. So there's quite a chunk in the middle here of doing Michaelis Menten and then looking at competitive, uncompetitive, non-competitive, and mixed competitive inhibition of enzymes. But like I say, I'm taking a slightly different slant on this. I'm definitely taking the slant of a biosensor rather than somebody who's maybe in drug discovery. Now at ZEP, we do have a whole range of assays on our website. Many of these assays are actually are rather enzyme based. So we've got a glucose assay, we've got a lactate biosensor, a hydrogen peroxide biosensor, an alcohol biosensor, a uric acid biosensor, a ketones biosensor, an androstenone biosensor, a cortisol biosensor, a galactose biosensor, a glycerol biosensor, an ATP, adenosine triphosphate biosensor, fructose, a urea, and a lactose. So the reason I highlight those particular biosensors as I'm going through there is because those in particular are enzyme based. So enzyme biosensors whose characteristics can be reflected through the Michaelis Menten equation are something that we definitely use, and there's definitely something that industry is, let's say, interested in. So the Michaelis Menten kinetics, First of all, based on a kind of model, and the model is this, that we have this kind of enzyme with an active site, and the enzyme may have a substrate, and the substrate binds into that active site. This is kind of biochemistry 101. Now, the binding constant, we can call it K plus 1, and sometimes people call that on. So that's essentially the on, so that you've got the enzyme and the substrate comes in, and that's the kind of, the binding is the on, and then it can also come off again, and we would call that K minus 1. So K plus 1, on, off, K minus 1. So there's this kind of kinetic of on and off. So sometimes people call this the binding on and let's say the unloading off. So on and off. Now enzymes have another, let's say, function, which is they don't just bind substrates, they actually convert them into, say, a new product. A real world example would be glucose oxidase that would convert glucose into actually glucolactone. Sometimes people say that glucose oxidase converts glucose into gluconic acid, but gluconic acid is actually a hydrolysis product of glucolactone. So the first thing that glucose oxidase produces from glucose is actually glucolactone. Another real world example would be lactate dehydrogenase, which would convert lactic acid into pyruvate. So this kind of conversion of a substrate, as an example, glucosolactic, into its product is commonly used in electrochemical biosensors. So S, or substrate, moves to product, and the rate at which we do it is of deep interest to people like ZP, because that rate tells us how much signal we're going to get. If essentially the reaction is fast, then that will give us essentially more reactions per second, and more reactions per second gives us stronger signal. So we are quite interested in that rate. And if we look at the rate of reaction, or the rate of production of P as a function of time, we will find that if we have a low concentration of substrate, we get a certain kind of rate of reaction. And then as we increase the substrate concentration, the rate of production of P essentially increases. So we keep on increasing S. And for a time here, we'll actually find that our biosensors are actually showing a linear signal, or a linear production of P versus the substrate. So that's great. We've got a nice linear, easy to essentially calibrate a sensor like that, because it's just a S is S, or the substrate concentration, which might be the unknown, is just linearly proportional to the signal from the sensor. But there is a moment where, in fact, we add more substrate, and we're not getting the same degree of linearity anymore. In fact, it starts to plateau off, and this is classical. If you ever make a glucose sensor, you can find that they have a certain linearity, and then that certain linearity ends up plateauing. And there are ways of increasing your linear response, which I'm not going to cover in this particular video, but we do actually discuss that elsewhere on our website and also on our YouTube channels. So the Michaelis Menten, or rather what I should say is, if you practically do this, where you look at signal or rate of production of P versus substrate concentration, you'll find a linear region, and then you'll find that it starts to taper off to a sort of plateau region. And this shape of this curve is can be modeled using the Michaelis Menten equation, where in fact this V here, this rate of reaction, which is also essentially my signal, if I'm thinking about my world of electrochemistry, is that rate here where S is being converted into P. Now we have a property up here where it's plateaued, and we call this property the V max, which basically says for this enzyme reaction, and maybe if I can say this enzyme reaction is taking place on a biosensor, this enzyme reaction is not going to take place any faster. And it's really governed by the activity of the enzyme and the amount of enzyme on that biosensor. So you can try to raise Vmax by putting more enzyme onto that biosensor, or you could increase Vmax by increasing the activity of that enzyme. though it's not necessarily easy to increase the activity of an enzyme unless you get into sort of deep enzyme engineering. And it's not always easy to put down extra enzyme. You may have a solubility problem. You may find that you're kind of getting diminishing returns, that you may be able to increase this a little bit, but actually not that much. So this overall shape of this curve is actually pretty well modeled by this equation where we kind of say the rate of reaction is equal to Vmax times the substrate concentration over Km, which is the Michaelis-Menten constant, plus the substrate concentration. And so we have this linear region, and this kind of linear region, we can define it by something called Vmax over 2. So if I drop a line down here, I would call this, rather it is called the Michaelis-Menten constant. The Michaelis-Menten constant from the curve is just equal to Vmax over 2. But Km is also a good way of defining a biosensor. So if you make a glucose sensor and I say to you, what's its Km, its Michaelis-Menten constant, and you tell me 10 millimolar, it tells me that your glucose sensor has a good linearity up to 10 millimolar. If you had a lactate sensor and I asked you what your Km value was and you said to me, oh, it's about 2 millimolar, then it tells me that that sensor is approximately linear up to about 2 millimolar. Now, if that's not linear enough to cover the clinical range, it's okay. There are other, let's say, strategies that can be put in place. I'm not going to discuss them here, but it's just to emphasize that signal from a biosensor or a signal from an enzyme biosensor is very well modeled by the Michaelis-Menten equation. And the Michaelis, when you plot, let's say, signal or rate of reaction, which is the production of P as a function of time, there's two properties that come out of this curve. Vmax. Vmax is super useful because it tells us how much signal can we really expect to get out of this particular biosensor. And then Km tells us what that linear range is for that particular biosensor. And when we're making glucose sensors, for example, we plot the signal versus concentration, we genuinely do get these kind of curves. So it's nice that the, let's say, Michaelis-Menten, which is something that you can learn sort of in undergraduate biochemistry or undergraduate chemistry or undergraduate biology, is something that actually does apply into the world of industrial biosensor development. I just want to discuss the insights a little bit, which I have mentioned here, which is the insights are that generally, I don't want to say all of the time, but generally, I would like quite a high Vmax. In biosensors, the more signal I'm getting, generally that's quite good. I don't want to overplay that comment because you can have so much Vmax that in fact the overall biosensor is too active. So if you have a very small volume and you have a sensor sitting in that small volume and it's very active, you could end up consuming all of the sample in that volume. And sometimes if you don't realize that's what's happening, it can give you some sort of results that you don't otherwise understand. So I don't want to overplay that. I always want this activity because it's in life is actually always a bit of a balance. But in general, rule of thumb, high Vmax is good because it gives us a lot of signal. But understand there are exceptions that you can end up trying to drive too much reaction, get too much signal, and end up consuming the analyte of interest, and then it will start giving you some weird results where you find it hard to find that your signal is linear to the substrate concentration because you're consuming the substrate concentration so quickly. The other useful parameter, and I said it on the previous slide, is actually Km, because I quite like a high Km. A high Km is really linked to a high Vmax, but a Km is useful because it tells us what the linearity. So if I'm looking for figures of merit or KPI, key performance indicators, and you're developing a series of biosensors, let's say you're developing a series of glucose sensors and you wanted to kind of compare them one to another, then the Vmax and the Km for those different formulations is a good way of being able to compare those biosensors. It's basically reducing their performance down to a couple of values, Vmax and Km, and that's why they're called key performance indicators. I just want to correct something that I see a little bit on YouTube where people confuse the Michaelis-Menten constant with a binding constant. So there's definitely some very well viewed videos on YouTube where they are confusing binding constant with Michaelis-Menten constant. So let me first of all describe a binding constant. So I have an enzyme, I have a substrate, they bind together. So I've got my K plus, which is my on, which forms this enzyme substrate complex, and then it may dissociate, or call it a K off, governed by this K minus 1. So we got a kind of on-off scenario. Now, a binding constant is really the kind of K plus 1 divided by K minus 1. So the higher that binding constant, the more likely it is to bind, and the less likely it is to dissociate. So the binding constant tells us the propensity for which that that substrate is binding with that enzyme. The reason I bring up, now I'm going to sort of slightly add to this and say, of course, in the case of an enzyme, we do have an extra functionality, which is that enzyme complex may not just dissociate back to enzyme and substrate. It may actually go on to form enzyme and release a, let's say, a product. And the Michaelis-Menten constant is not just the binding constant. In fact, first of all, you could almost consider it the inverse of the binding constant, because Km is actually equal to K minus 1 over K plus 1. And on top of the numerator, we've got this extra term K cat, which is the catalytic rate of reaction. So be careful, because there are definitely very well viewed videos that talk about binding constant and call the Michaelis-Menten, by the way, a binding constant, and it's really not. It's actually, not vaguely, but partially it's the inverse of binding constant, but it's not just the inverse, because it's actually got this extra term K cat. So be careful when you're watching online videos about Michaelis-Menten being the binding constant for the enzyme. It's not. Now I'm going to talk here about competitive inhibition. I'm going to talk about uncompetitive inhibition. I'm talking about non-competitive inhibition. I'm also going to talk about mixed inhibition. The reason being is I'm coming from the world of biosensors. So for example, if I've made a glucose sensor, I'm very happy with it, and I'm using a glucose enzyme. If I've got a substrate if I've got an analyte that I really want to detect and I can't find an enzyme for it, but actually discover that it actually inhibits glucose oxidase, for example, I can actually use its ability to inhibit an enzyme reaction as the basis for a biosensor. So let's just describe some inhibitions then. So we have an enzyme that has an inhibitor, and the inhibitor could bind specifically into the active site. And then I have the natural substrate, for example, in the case of glucose oxidase, the glucose wants to bind, but in fact it is blocked. There's something bound in that active site. The glucose is hindered from actually binding into that site. So we could call that competitive inhibition. We've got uncompetitive inhibition, where I've got that enzyme with its active site. I've got its substrate. The substrate binds in. It's all very good. But actually, it's another molecule binds near the active site, and for example, could actually end up holding the substrate actually in the active site. You can actually, at this point, you could actually say, well, it's essentially the substrate is essentially stuck in place or bound in place, and so the overall rate of enzyme reaction is actually decreased because of this prolonged blocking of the active site by the substrate. So that's a sort of uncompetitive inhibition. Uncompetitive because the molecule causing the decrease in enzyme kinetics is not binding into the site, it's just aiding the retention of the original substrate in the site. Non-competitive, or sometimes called allosteric inhibition, is where you've got a molecule that's binding to the enzyme, but that molecule's remote from the active site, but in binding it's caused some sort of conformational change that's actually then causing the substrate not to be able to necessarily access and bind to the site. So it's non-competitive because it's not binding into the active site. It is, as I say, maybe remote from the active site, but in binding remotely, it's causing some sort of change that then stops the original substrate. For example, in the case of glucose oxidase, the glucose binding to the active site. And then you can have a mixture of uncompetitive and non-competitive, where you really have a mix. Yeah, you have a mixture of the two. So we can have this kind of uncompetitive binding, which would stop the substrate entering, or we could have a case where we have the substrate binding, and in fact then it sort of binds outside and holds the substrate in place. So let me just go back and make sure I get those terms correct. So we've got mixed competitive, and so I just want to go back slightly more. So I would call this the non-competitive binding or non-competitive inhibition, where it's really remote, that binding, but it is stopping the substrate accessing the site. Or you can have uncompetitive binding, where the substrate has got in, but it's held in place by another binding. And so sometimes you can have this kind of mixed inhibition of enzymes. Now, this is very interesting to people in the drug discovery world. This is a lot of what's actually they're doing when they make small molecules for drug discovery, and that eventually end up in pharmaceutical drugs. This is the kind of mechanisms that they're playing with. They're inhibiting some sort of enzyme and therefore trying to relieve or cure diseases that way. For us, let's say in the world of biosensors, you can use this phenomena to actually essentially measure the inhibitor. So it could be the inhibitor that's actually your target. So you've got a perfectly well functioning enzyme reaction, but the inhibitor then inhibits, and your drop in signal due to the inhibition tells you how much inhibitor is actually in the sample. I don't think this is used a lot in electrochemical biosensors, but it's possibly not used a lot because what we're discussing here is, I wouldn't say so much novel. I mean, it seems obvious to me, but maybe doing this connection that I'm making is is a novel, let's say, concept. Inhibitors and kinetics. So let's start off with our Michaelis Menten. So many of our, let's say, biosensors would kind of follow this profile where they have a Vmax and a Km, and I've discussed how useful those key performance indicators are for when ranking different formulations of enzymes to say which one's better than the other. So they're useful parameters to us. Now, in the case if you've got a competitive inhibition, you will find that your kinetics are slightly, let's say, decreased. And it's something that's just occurred to me actually, is sometimes when we're formulating enzyme reactions, we can end up maybe sometimes accidentally creating competitive inhibitions. I'm just thinking about data that we've gathered over the years. And I realize that sometimes actually it's kind of useful to us, because in this particular case, what we're doing is we're increasing the linearity actually. The Vmax stays the same, but the linearity is essentially improved, because you can see that through the Km increase. So I'm realizing sometimes when we're formulating enzyme biosensors, we can put a bit of a cocktail into those formulations, and I realize that some of those maybe extra molecules are actually slightly inhibiting the enzyme, but that's sometimes good for us because actually it gives us a slightly higher Km. So if you've got, like I say, a native enzyme and you've got a signal that looks like this Michaelis Menten response in the green here, and then later on you've kind of formulated it and you actually still get the same Vmax, but in fact your Km is increased, then you may have a case of competitive inhibition. If you've got uncompetitive inhibition, you can end up decreasing the Vmax and actually decreasing the Km. So uncompetitive inhibition, if you kind of find that your Vmax is of your biosensor system and the Km is decreasing, then you could be in an uncompetitive inhibition state. You can also find the same with non-competitive inhibition as well, that in overall non-competitive inhibition may end up with a lower Vmax and a lower Km. So if you want to understand whether you've got competitive inhibition, then it's only the Km that essentially is increased, but the Vmax stays the same. And when you've got uncompetitive or non-competitive, then in fact the Vmax decreases and the Km also decreases. And I should have added sort of mixed here as well, because essentially the mixed situation is a really sort of a sum of uncompetitive and non-competitive inhibition as well. So I've got here technologies for developers. So I just want to say that, in fact, I've got the technology in front of me. So at ZP, this particular take on the Michaelis Menten kinetics has been really from the perspective of electrochemical biosensor development. So at ZP, we do a lot of electrochemical biosensor development. We actually do it on a system, and when I say a system, I'll just put my hand on it now. We're doing it on essentially electrodes that look like this. So these are screen printed electrodes from ZP. We're functionalizing these electrodes by essentially adding enzymes. There's a black stripe on here, or we also do a circular electrode version. And we're basically functionalizing those electrodes, and then we're driving those electrodes by a series of techniques. The most classic technique used in electrochemical biosensors is amperometry. So it's quite easy to say that amperometry is very widely used. In fact, there's a number of what we call CGMs, continuous glucose monitors, on the market. In fact, I have one behind me. And they're mostly using amperometry. So if you've seen people wearing these, they often wear them kind of here, next to the skin, not through the clothes. On here, there's a little filament. I'll maybe be able to get that filament to show, just against my finger there. That filament is actually the electrode system. So it's actually the same science as the little electrodes on here. All right, so the reason I'm saying this is because at ZP, we're talking about this Michaelis Menten and actually its usefulness, and actually we do help in the development of biosensors. I think the easiest biosensor format to develop is what I call point of care diagnostics, and when we're doing that, we're doing it on a platform called the Sensor or Potentiostat. I'm just going to scan amperometry quickly. So that's amperometry. So it's QR code driven. So if you're doing if you're doing enzymes, amperometry is a good technique. I also think square wave voltammetry is a good technique as well. So I'll just scan that one for a second as well. So I'm able to go between these different techniques using a QR code. And then what's nice is I'm in Bluetooth connection with this device. Now the reason ZP has developed this is because there's a real problem there's a lot of biosensor development going on. And it's hard for startups to actually get to what we call an MVP, a minimally viable product. And actually this particular potentiostat, with its ability, and in fact I'll demonstrate that now, we're able to convert from just doing methods, which would be kind of a traditional electrochemical methods, into actual end user applications. So here, for example, I've scanned the QR code and I've turned this meter now actually into a glucose meter effectively, because I use a different QR code. So we do have a technology suite where we have very good electrodes which can be functionalized with the appropriate enzymes. We've got the method files. We've also got a data pipe as well, where actually we can convert signal, if I can put it that, into actual concentrations, because you can put your calibration factors into a cloud system and that will then convert it into raw signal. So let me just go back and share the screen and just say, so if you're interested in developing biosensors, please kind of look up the Sensor platform. I may put a link underneath this video as well, because that's then works with a system, it works with a cloud system called Julie, where we can convert amperometry, for example, into lactate concentration, glucose concentration, ketones concentration. As long as you've done a calibration curve, that can be then coded into the cloud. So then the workflow is kind of, you have this kind of meter, you put your sensor on the meter, you put your sample on the sensor, you scan a QR code which puts the sensor into the right kind of mode. If it's R&D, it would be amperometry. If you'd already developed an assay, then you would have a QR code for that assay. The meter runs the sample, gives the raw data back to the app. The app sends the data to a cloud system called Julie. So I'll just turn this off for a second. And then Julie pre-processes the data, processes the data, and then actually converts it essentially into information. So for example, glucose, it could be 5 millimolar or 90 mg per DL. And the end user actually gets the result on their phone. So ZP, we're really focused on converting science that's otherwise essentially locked into the laboratory into real numbers that can be used by essentially real people, if I can put it that way, outside of the laboratory in their real world applications. And that will really then help to move society onwards. So if you've got any questions on Michaelis Menten, you want other videos around ZP's take on sometimes these things, because our take is it's all about electrochemical biosensors. So the Michaelis Menten is often talked about from just an enzyme kinetics perspective, but these enzyme kinetics actually do model biosensors really well. So if you want us to add extra videos, you have questions about biosensors in general, then please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Okay, thanks very much.